Greetings, travelers. You already know what day it is. It's current day in current year. However, on this day, we're going to talk about Machinist. The first thing to talk about on Machinist is how to pronounce this job's name. I say Machinist, but I've also heard Machinist. Now, according to Google, it's pronounced Machinist. Well, I don't really care what the official pronunciation is, but I will say that when you go to get your car fixed, I hope that you aren't hiring a machinic. Now, why do you want to play Machinist? I would say it's to do damage, but I already know that the real reason is that you just thought that Hilda was hot. Man, Heaven's Word really did have two hot characters to get people to play jobs. This is the selfish physical range DPS. So like Samurai and Black Mage, you don't offer anything other than the raw damage that you can output on this class. Bard and Dancer will bring raid buffs, but you just bring guns. Some people might mention Tactician up front, but all physical range jobs have a party mitigation button, similar to how Samurai has Feint and Black Mage has Addle. The big difference between Machinist and those two is that Machinist doesn't do as much damage as Black Mage or Samurai. This is because of the concept of the physical range tax. The general idea is that this role archetype, being defined by being ranged and having no cast times, means it should never have to stop damaging in content compared to being a melee or being a caster. As a result, with full uptime, it will be outperformed by Black Mage and Samurai. However, in high-end content where you have to execute tight strategies and melees and casters might miss a few GCDs, Machinist is still outperformed by these classes. I do think the job could use a little bit of a buff because it's a bit overtaxed at the moment. If you're really curious, this job is doing about 6 to 7% less damage than Samurai on average. Take that as you will, averages are not the be-all end-all for statistics. While 6 to 7% might not sound like a lot, it is currently doing less individual damage than Summoner, which also has a battle raise and a party DPS buff. Don't worry about the metagame though, this job is still very viable in high-end content as long as you put in the time. Now that I've limited your expectations, let's talk about the jank up front. The other annoying part of Machinist is punishing you for playing on a dial-up connection, or for playing on servers that are far away from your location. This is thanks to Hypercharge, a burst window where your GCD will go down to 1.5 seconds and you need to single weave in between all those GCDs for maximum damage output. Given that this class's value is entirely determined by how much damage you can output, it really punishes players for having bad internet. Now, I don't have an easy way to check your compatibility, but if your internet doesn't allow you to easily double weave on other classes, you're probably not going to be able to single weave efficiently during Hypercharge. Can you still play this class anyways? Of course, especially if you're just playing normal content. Although if you plan to do high-end content, I would advise against laggy Machinist, as it's probably the only class that is borderline unplayable on bad ping. And even if you don't care about trying to play super well, you will still probably get frustrated when trying to hypercharge on bad internet. It's unfortunate, but thankfully this is the only job in the game that really works this way, where it's still not optimal to be laggy on other jobs. It's not even playable on lag for Machinist. You might think I'm using hyperbole here, which I am not. This is by far the job that punishes a bad internet connection the most of any job in Final Fantasy XIV. With the initial warnings completed, this is a Heaven's Word job, meaning you need access to Ishgard before you can unlock the class. If you are just starting in Final Fantasy XIV, the Heaven's Word jobs will be completely inaccessible until you progress far enough into the MSQ. This is something that the devs quickly realized was a bad decision and haven't punished players for in expansions since. But at the absolute minimum, you will have to be level 50 before being able to unlock this class, and then start at level 30 on Machinist. It is hilarious to consider that it is very likely that you will be level 60 and able to unlock Dancer before you can unlock Machinist if you just started playing. Unlike when I made my video on Dark Knight, you do not get to abuse tank queue times if you try to level through roulettes. So you could go into Palace of the Dead instead, but just know that the gameplay experience before level 35 is also pretty awful on this class. You don't get a real hypercharge phase until level 35 and the true hypercharge phase at level 50. So even if you're trying to litmus test the class and see if you can weave correctly on your internet, sorry, you're going to have to hit at least level 35 first. The Final Fantasy XIV leveling experience. What a mess. If you are wondering exactly what you are testing for, it's being able to single weave in between heat blasts while still being able to use heat blast 5 times during hypercharge. As an additional point here, just be aware that you want to use hypercharge right before heat blast and not right after a GCD to make it easier to get 5 heat blasts in. So what you really want to pay attention to is while weaving in between heat blasts that the cooldown keeps spinning, while also keeping in mind that you do not double weave in between heat blasts. On the plus side, I can say that at level 50, this job has surprisingly most of its kit, making the gameplay experience at level 50 pretty okay. With all of that out of the way, you already know what I'm going to do. Yes, I will aggressively remind you to support the channel, so you better subscribe, hit the like button, and post my videos on social media and get downvoted. The continued support here has been incredible. I am genuinely grateful. As a reminder, I plan to do a karaoke livestream at 10,000 subscribers to embarrass myself for your entertainment. I also have started up a Discord community where it is possible to argue over DPS optimization. We accept all players, even mentors. Now with that out of the way, it's time to talk about some guns. Now in case you can't really tell, there's only one reason I leveled this job originally. It was so I could try to make a Bloodborne glamour set. In fact, this outfit is supposed to be Lady Maria from the Old Hunters DLC. I think if you squint enough, it's pretty close. I almost forgot who I stole this outfit from, but I will link it in the description. I also tried to get this revolver because it reminds me of the Evelyn. Yeah, I can't really see the resemblance either. While I actually like the job aesthetic, this walking battle animation is by far the worst in the game. I mean, this gun is a flamethrower and a machine gun and also apparently a fucking vacuum cleaner. It just looks so stupid. The sprint animation is so crisp, but the walk animation looks like an idiot trying to hold a rocket launcher in one hand. It's just plain awkward. That's one of my only really serious complaints. I might sound like I'm nitpicking, but that's because I am. Out of all jobs, this has to be the worst battle moving animation, and that's an objective fact. While at the same time, you will look insanely stylish while using skills, so it's kind of a mixed bag. As a reminder, I don't really make these videos as leveling guides. I did say that you have the bulk of your skills at level 50, but you have a bit to go before you get things like drill and flamethrower. Rook Auto Turret will also change into Automaton Queen, which makes your battery gauge behave differently at level 80. So while leveling, it's important to get used to weaving in between hypercharged GCDs and trying to land 6 GCDs during Wildfire, which you can accomplish by hypercharging sometime around Wildfire. I will go into more details on this later, but that's the stuff that you can pay attention to up front. Also, the nice thing about Rook Auto Turret, when you summon it, it has a skill where it does a final blast before leaving. This will actually happen automatically. You do not have to manually toggle the self-destruct sequence. The only reason that it exists is if you have your turret out and the boss is about to leave and it wouldn't have time to use the skill automatically, then you can trigger it manually. This is something that you do generally want to try and avoid though. And those are some of the things that you should probably know while leveling, and some tips to make your low level gameplay practice somewhat worthwhile. Alright, let's talk about some AoE. Spread shot is a cone AoE that's range is kinda confusing. Try to hit as many things as you can. It also builds up heat, which does nothing for your AoE until you hit level 52. Nice. Anyways, for level 80 AoE, you should be using Hypercharge and trying to get 5 auto crossbows in on the pack. Typically, starting a trash pack damaging session with Bioblaster is good so that you can get the full dot damage. Note, the only dot on Machinist is the AoE skill. And yes, you should use Flamethrower on trash packs and become a Black Mage as you stand still to get all of your damage out. The tooltip on this is about as useful as the male nipple, so to clarify, it applies the 100 potency damage every second while active, which would have been very useful to know when I first unlocked this skill. If everything's on cooldown and you don't have enough heat to auto crossbow, that's when it makes the most sense to spread shot and go back to building up heat. Surprisingly, AoE is not too complicated on Machinist. It's just annoying while leveling where you get all of this heat and you have nothing to use it on. The only thing I haven't mentioned yet is Reassemble. It's a buff that makes it so that your next skill is guaranteed to be a critical direct hit. For true optimization, if you're fighting exactly 3 enemies, you want to use Reassemble on Drill, but for anything with 4 or more enemies, use it on either Spread Shot or Auto Crossbow. And with that, that's pretty much everything you need to know about taking out the trash. Now, as usual, I'm going over an opener here, but there are a few different openers that jobs have at their disposal. The one I'm going to go over here is usually fine, but depending on your party composition, there might be one that is better suited for your needs because of what raid buffs you are trying to take advantage of. I don't think it really needs to be mentioned, but these guides do serve as a baseline to understanding what jobs even do, rather than serving as a true journey into complete optimization. I believe it's best to get comfortable with the tools that you have at your disposal before you can really start thinking about going into some of the more advanced territory. To begin, Machinist has one of the nicest pre-pulls in existence. You want to reassemble about 3 seconds before combat. If you are using a damage pot, this is also where you use it right before your first GCD. We start with a reassemble boosted drill right at 0 seconds on the battle timer. Weave gauze round and ricochet. Use heated split shot and weave barrel stabilizer. Use heated slug shot. Now use air anchor. Double weave gauze round and ricochet. Now finish your 3-button combo with heated clean shot, weave gauze round, and hypercharge. In this hypercharge window, you use heat blast and weave wildfire, then heat blast and weave ricochet, now heat blast and use gauze round, and you keep alternating heat blast and ricochet and heat blast and gauze round. After the 5th heat blast, which will end with weaving a gauze round, hypercharge will run out. You should be able to use drill again. Weave gauze round and ricochet after that drill. Finally, complete the opener with a heated split shot and weave gauze round. After that heated split shot, Wildfire should detonate, and you manage to fit 6 GCDs in for its duration. With that, you have finished the general opener, and I can now explain what goes on. The most generic way to look at Machinist outside of anything fancy is using your 3-button combo until you need to use either drill or air anchor. This isn't particularly hard until you start messing it up. Now you're wondering how that can even happen. It's not like it's random when these skills come off cooldown, but that's how it is. Sometimes you're just a little too lost in the sauce with the 3-button rotation and you let these cooldowns drift. However, that's what you want to try to avoid doing. In a perfect world, you use drill and air anchor as soon as they are off cooldown. And yeah, that's literally everything to the bland rotation. It's not a whole lot when you look at it this way. In addition to the generic GCD cooldowns, you also have 2 different meters to manage. This is when things can get a bit trickier from the management side of things, so I'll start with the easier one. Your battery gauge will allow you to summon the Automaton Queen once you are level 80. You can do this as long as you have at least 50 battery. You generate battery by either using air anchor or using the 3rd button of your 3-button combo. You can use the skill at any value from 50 to 100 battery, but it will consume the entire gauge when you use it. Now, Final Fantasy XIV is not exactly a great game when it comes to having pets, but I'll get the positives out of the way first. Automaton Queen will always do the same amount of damage per battery gauge, no matter when you use it. It will also mirror the benefits of all DPS buffs that you have on yourself, except for Dragon Sight. Finally, it has one of these self-destruct skills, which it will automatically do right at the end of its duration. Cool, that all sounds pretty alright. The downside is that it is so slow. It takes Automaton Queen about a century to summon and actually get to the boss. My static can progress through Savage faster than this rocket-powered mech, which is pretty annoying, because while you're trying to take advantage of raid buffs, Automaton Queen is taking advantage of being melee. It can actually be quite irritating to time this in a way that feels good. So rather than torture yourself, the most brain-dead way to use this is to summon the Queen whenever you use Reassemble and Drill. This should happen about every minute or every 3rd drill depending on how specific you want to be. And this is because most raid buffs are on some kind of minute timer, meaning you'll take advantage of at least some raid buffs if you time it on the minute mark. Once again, there are better ways to optimize battery, but just having a general idea can help you get started. Since I kind of just skimmed over it right there, when talking about reassemble, you always want to pair it with drill. Even though it has a 55-second cooldown, you will use it closer to every minute. Drill and air anchor do have the same potency, but air anchor when used on cooldown will not line up with every single reassemble, hence why we use it on drill. So typically, every minute you should be able to get a reassembled drill and summon the Automaton Queen. If you manage to ignore the battery for long enough, always use the summon to avoid overcapping the battery gauge. But if you're using it every minute, you should never reach 100 battery. The other meter that you have to deal with is heat. Each button as part of your generic 3-button combo will give you 5 heat, and Barrel Stabilizer will give you 50 heat when you use it. Barrel Stabilizer has a 2-minute cooldown, and when you put all of this together, Assuming you are playing perfectly and managing all timers correctly, you will generate exactly 195 heat in the first 2 minutes with only heated shots, not including barrel stabilizer. Which, even if you're not a mathematician, you will probably realize that 195 is not divisible by 50, which is how much heat you need to use hypercharge. What this means is that you can generally generate enough heat to get 3 to 4 hypercharge windows in every 2 minutes. However, since you don't generate heat during hypercharge, when you do an extra hypercharge phase, you generate 180 heat in those 2 minutes instead. I'm already making this sound extra complicated. Instead, when you get 50 heat, you don't want to immediately hypercharge, because when you go into a hypercharge window, you are essentially locking yourself out from using either drill or air anchor for about 7.5 seconds. Not that you can't use other GCDs, but you want to use Heat Blast 5 times to not waste the hypercharge. So the rule of thumb is that if either drill or air anchor has about 8 seconds or less left on the cooldown, you should wait to hypercharge until you use those cooldowns and can comfortably use Heat Blast without Tokyo drifting drill or air anchor's cooldown. You want to make sure that you hypercharge enough to not overcap the meter as well. And the rule of thumb here is that if Wildfire has about 33 seconds left on the cooldown and you have less than 65 heat, you're going to need to skip a hypercharge window. If you have 65 or more heat, then you need to hypercharge one more time before Wildfire to avoid overcapping the meter. Honestly though, this is something that just gets easier the more that you play. You will have a better idea of how to manage heat with practice. Me explaining it like this makes it sound harder than it is, but this is one of the trickier parts to playing this job well. One last set of cooldowns to note, both Gauze Round and Ricochet gain a charge every 30 seconds. Since Heat Blast will reduce the cooldown of each of these by 15 seconds every time it is used, you generally want to have one stack on each cooldown at most to ensure that you don't accidentally overcap their stack count during Heat Blast. As far as when you place these additional Gauze Rounds and Ricochets, you can technically weave them whenever you want. It is easiest to use them as soon as you get a second stack. Although if you really want to go up the optimization tree, trying to place them around raid buffs is optimal, but will also make it a little bit harder to avoid overcapping. The last thing to really talk about is Wildfire. This is also on a 2-minute cooldown. You want to get 6 GCDs in under Wildfire to get the maximum amount of damage this skill can do. There are a few different ways to accomplish this. If we go back to the opener, what we did was use Wildfire after the first Heat Blast of a hypercharge window. Thus, we got 4 Heat Blasts in and then used 2 GCDs afterwards, which was enough to hit the 6 GCDs necessary for Wildfire. One thing to note is that we used Drill on the 5th GCD and not the 6th. This is due to some complicated stuff, but Drill's damage is registered when the animation goes off, not as soon as you use the skill. So if you try to use it as the 6th GCD of a Wildfire, it will usually not count. This is also true for Air Anchor. So the method used in the opener works a little bit better for catching some raid buffs. However, the most lenient way to use Hypercharge and Wildfire is to use a double weaving window to double weave first Wildfire and then Hypercharge. This way you can get 5 Heat Blasts in under Wildfire and then use a 6 GCD after Hypercharge, and you get the maximum damage out of Wildfire. This timing is a little bit less strict, which will make it a bit easier overall. And the last method is a bit different, where you use Wildfire right before a GCD, then Hypercharge and use 5 Heat Blasts. All 3 of these methods will work to get the most damage out of Wildfire from your own gameplay. The reason why you might want to time this cooldown differently from a true optimization standpoint is to take advantage of raid buffs. Wildfire will snapshot all buffs when it is first applied, meaning whatever buffs you have as soon as you use it will contribute towards its damage and nothing afterwards. Also, Wildfire cannot be a critical or a direct hit, so it will not benefit from things like Devilment or Battle Litany. In reality though, if you're just trying to pick up the job, using one of the 3 methods that feels the easiest to you is going to be the best, because the biggest damage loss on this skill is going to be not getting 6 GCDs in during its duration. Now when you put everything together on this class, what should happen is that every minute you will get Reassemble back up, which you will use on Drill. During this, you also generally want to use Automaton Queen at some point. Every 2 minutes is when everything is going to line up again. You want to land another Reassemble Drill and use Air Anchor. It's also time to use Automaton Queen again. Wildfire will also come back up on the 2-minute mark as well. Ensure that you have enough heat to be able to get in the GCDs that you need to after using that drill and air anchor. Finally, the only thing that might be confusing is that barrel stabilizer will come off cooldown before Wildfire because of where we placed it in the opener. You will usually have too much heat to use barrel stabilizer right away. So for the easy mode past the opener, you will use barrel stabilizer after Wildfire and not before, to avoid overcapping heat and making it easier for hypercharge phase alignments. I will put an asterisk here. This isn't truly optimal, but it's a slight DPS loss to make your rotation much easier. The only other thing that's kind of silly to mention is that all of these timers are completely based around you having a GCD of 2.5 seconds. For every 0.06 seconds faster GCD speed, you want to delay the 2-minute drill by a single GCD. This will make everything line up better if you are in a faster GCD tier. As usual, that's one of the more unintuitive things to optimize. But the reason why I mention it is if you are wondering why things might not be lining up for you, even though you swear that you're playing correctly, this could be the reason why. And as I previously mentioned, always ensure that you don't overcap Gauss Round or Ricochet. And with all of that, that's all the cooldowns and meter tracking that you have to do on Machinist. Finally, in terms of utility, like all physical range jobs, you do have a skill to reduce party damage taken by 10% in the form of Tactician. This is the only skill that you have that provides any sort of party benefit, so using it to help your healers with heavy-hitting raid-wide attacks is useful. You also get head graze to interrupt specific mechanics occasionally, which will randomly become mandatory in certain encounters, where you will be the backup if a tank forgets to use interject. You still have second wind to heal yourself a little bit when needed, and good old arm's length to ignore most knockback mechanics. And I'm just going to pretend that leg graze and foot graze don't exist. Overall, Machinist is a pretty okay job. Some people might get a bit frustrated when they see it in their party because, like Samurai and Black Mage, if you're really bad at the job, you won't contribute very much to the party. Although Machinist is in a pretty mediocre spot in the metagame, its gameplay doesn't have the randomness that you get from playing the other physical range jobs, which can either make it more consistent or less exciting depending on how you feel about it. The only thing I can say for certain is that, kind of like with Monk, it can get really boring at times because there isn't exactly a ton of stuff going on all the time. If you start playing it a lot, you might end up feeling like it doesn't provide enough variety. Although the hypercharge phase is pretty fast and fun if you have decent ping. They kind of just need to add a little bit more to the job for it to not get super monotonous. Not to say that there isn't anything to manage right now, but it does feel a bit shallow at times. For me personally, I think it's pretty okay for the time being. Now let's get out there and beat up the Orphan of Kos.